Please don't call the police. I was just hungry, but when the billionaire saw the child's face, he dropped his phone in shock. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear it. And if you're enjoying the content, give the video a like to help support the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The back door of the restaurant clicked shut behind Julian Roth, muting the hum of clinking glasses and low jazz spilling from the private dining room. He stepped into the alley, the cold air cutting through his tailored jacket. His phone vibrated again in his palm, lighting up with yet another missed call from his COO. He swiped it away, letting out a breath. The night was one of those unusually quiet ones in the city. Damp pavement, a flickering security light overhead, and the faint reek of fish and fryer oil from the dumpsters. He needed 5 minutes to think. Just 5 minutes, without being told how the Singapore deal might fall through, or how the market was reacting to his latest public silence. Then came the noise, a soft clatter behind the metal bins too light to be a raccoon. He paused, phone halfway to his ear. Another shuffle, followed by what sounded like a small cough. Julian moved cautiously toward the source. His shoes tapped softly on the wet concrete. He leaned slightly to one side, peering around the dumpster, expecting maybe a stray dog or a drunk sleeping off the night. What he saw, instead, made him freeze. There, crouched beside a soggy cardboard box, was a child. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, rail thin, bundled in a too big hoodie that hung past his hands. His shoes didn't match, one sneaker, one sandal, and his bare ankles were rubbed raw from the cold. He was hunched over a crumpled styrofoam container, fingers digging into it with quiet desperation. The bread roll he clutched was mostly intact, but his mouth and chin were smeared with tomato sauce, like he'd torn into it without caring how messy it got. Julian's shadow must have reached him, because the boy looked up suddenly, startled. His hands flew to his chest as if to shield the food. Then, eyes wide, he shook his head quickly. "Please don't call the police," the boy said, breath short and panicked. "I wasn't stealing. I was just hungry." Julian said nothing. His fingers tightened around his phone. The boy's voice wasn't angry or loud. It was small, practiced, like this wasn't the first time he'd had to plead. "I didn't break anything," the boy added. "I just took what someone threw away." Julian looked at the takeout box. Still warm, probably dropped in the bin less than 30 minutes ago. He took a slow step forward. The boy flinched and shifted backward on his knees. "I'm not going to hurt you," Julian said. "Are you alone?" The boy hesitated, glancing toward the mouth of the alley, like he was considering a run for it. "I'm fine," he said quickly. "I was just going to eat and go." Julian's phone buzzed again. He barely noticed. His attention stayed locked on the child's face. Something in the way his nose crinkled when he spoke, the way he curled slightly inward when he sat, something flickered in Julian's memory. He stepped closer, crouching slowly to not scare him off. The boy backed into the brick wall, but didn't run. "What's your name?" Julian asked. The boy hesitated. "Eli." Julian stared at him, trying to shake off the strange pressure building in his chest. "Eli," he repeated, almost under his breath. "How old are you?" 7. Julian's fingers twitched. He set the phone down on the concrete beside him without thinking. A strange hum filled his ears, dull and steady. Eli was watching him cautiously, still gripping the piece of bread like it might be taken from him any second. "You don't have a coat," Julian said. "It's freezing out here." "I'm used to it." "Where's your mom?" "She's working." "Does she know you're out here?" Eli looked away. I was supposed to wait, but I got hungry. Julian's eyes scanned the boy's face again, slower this time, taking in the rounded jaw, the dimple in one cheek that appeared when he bit down on his lip, familiar. Not like someone he'd seen once, like someone he'd known. Eli, Julian started, then stopped himself. He reached for the phone again, but his hand shook slightly. When he picked it up, he glanced down to dial, then back at the boy. The angle changed. The streetlight caught his face differently, and in that moment, Julian felt the world narrow into a single point. He dropped the phone. It hit the concrete with a loud clack, bouncing once before, skidding to a stop beside the dumpster. Eli stared at it, startled, then looked back at Julian. "You okay?" he asked warily. Julian swallowed hard. "Caleb?" he whispered. The name wasn't meant for Eli. It wasn't a question to be answered. It was a memory surfacing in a wave he hadn't expected. Caleb, his brother, 16 when he died, the same slope of the nose, the same way he tilted his head when confused. Eli shook his head slowly. "What did you say?" Julian didn't answer. He just stared. The past was crashing into him in a place that smelled like rotting onions and spilled beer. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to see this boy. He wasn't supposed to feel like he was seeing a ghost. Eli stood up slowly, holding the takeout box to his chest. "I'll go," he said. "You don't got to do anything. Just don't call anyone." Julian stood as well, stiffly. His fingers brushed through his hair like he was trying to reboot his thoughts. "Wait," he said. "Don't leave yet." Eli hesitated. Why? Julian didn't have a good answer, not yet. He just knew something was wrong with how deeply this moment was affecting him. This wasn't just another kid on the street. He'd seen hundreds, donated millions. But something about Eli felt personal, and he needed to understand why. "I'm not going to call the cops," Julian said. "I just want to talk." Eli narrowed his eyes. "You're weird." "Probably," Julian replied. There was a silence between them, thin but oddly comfortable. Eli lowered himself back onto the concrete, slowly finishing his food like he didn't fully believe he was safe, but was willing to test the theory. Julian didn't move. He watched him eat, each bite small and deliberate, as if he was trying to make it last. He pulled out his wallet, unsure what he was even doing. Money wasn't the right gesture, but it was his first instinct. Eli saw it and stiffened. "I'm not begging," he said. "I know." Julian put the wallet away. Another long pause. "Can I at least walk you to where your mum works?" Eli shrugged. "She's not there now. Won't be back till late." "Where do you go when she's working?" Eli didn't answer. Julian took a breath. "Can you meet me here again tomorrow?" The boy gave him a suspicious look. "Why?" I'd like to talk again. Maybe bring you something warm. Like food? And a coat." Eli studied him for a moment. "You're not going to try anything weird?" "No." Eli stood, dusting crumbs from his hoodie. "Okay, I guess." Then he turned and walked off into the night, disappearing past the row of dumpsters, one shoe flapping softly against the concrete. Julian stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the place where the boy had been, the dropped phone still sitting forgotten on the ground beside him. Julian didn't sleep that night. He went back inside the restaurant after Eli disappeared into the shadows, but the wine tasted sour, and the dessert course sat untouched in front of him, while his business partners carried on without noticing his silence. Every few minutes, his mind circled back to that moment behind the dumpster, the boy's voice, his name, the way he stood there, clutching a crumpled takeout box like it was the most important thing in the world. The resemblance had shaken him more than he could admit, even to himself, Eli. 7 years old, living off scraps, shoes falling apart, alone in an alley. And yet, somehow, looking like a living echo of someone Julian had spent years trying to forget. Caleb, his younger brother, 16 when he died. They hadn't spoken in over a year by then. Not since Caleb had dropped out of school and started bouncing between juvenile programs, shelters, and the streets. Julian had been too busy in college, too focused on internships and finance courses, too annoyed with the constant phone calls from his mother asking him to talk some sense into Caleb. The last time he'd answered, they'd argued. Julian told him to grow up. Caleb had told him to screw off. A week later, there was a call from the hospital. Overdose. No one knew who found him or how long he'd been lying there. Just a Jane Doe room number and a nurse who kept apologizing. Julian had shown up too late. The casket was closed. Now, almost 2 decades later, he was looking into the face of a boy who shouldn't have looked anything like Caleb, and yet somehow did. The next morning, Julian returned to the alley. He had a bag with him this time. Sandwiches, bottled water, a new hoodie, and a child-sized coat he'd asked his driver to pick up from a 24-hour store. The dumpsters were still there. So was the smell. But the boy wasn't. He waited 10 minutes, then 30, walked to the end of the block and back again. Nothing. A couple of employees from the restaurant came out for smoke breaks, gave him strange looks, then went back inside. He tried the alley again in the afternoon, then again after dark. Still no sign of Eli. The third night, he parked his car a block away and sat there in silence, headlights off, eyes fixed on the restaurant's back exit. He watched a cook come out to dump a bag of trash. A delivery guy passed through later with a case of bottled wine, but no kid. His phone buzzed with missed calls and messages. His assistant wanted to confirm his morning schedule. His legal team had sent a briefing. There was a meeting about the firm's London expansion that he hadn't reviewed. He ignored all of it. By midnight, he finally drove home, restless. He paced his penthouse like he hadn't done in years. The place felt larger than usual, colder. The marble floors echoed under his steps. In the guest bedroom, the coat still sat in the bag on the chair. He sat down beside it, pulled out the coat, and ran his thumb along the inside tag. No name. That's what kept circling in his head. Eli had no name on him, no backpack, no number, nothing to call if something happened. Just that oversized hoodie and shoes that didn't match. Julian didn't like unanswered questions, especially ones that left him feeling like he'd let something important slip past him. By the 4th day, he gave up waiting. He made a call. The man who answered didn't waste time with greetings. You haven't asked for anything in 5 years. What's going on? Julian leaned against the window, watching the sky shift from grey to blue over the skyline. I need someone found. A kid, about 7 years old, says his name is Eli. He was behind Tasso's restaurant a few nights ago, wearing a grey hoodie and mismatched shoes. A pause. Run away? I don't know. He said his mum works a lot, and they don't have a home. That's all he gave me. I'll pull camera feeds, check shelters, follow up with hospital reports. Give me a day. Julian hung up and stood still, the phone in his hand, the world outside waking up with morning traffic and building noise. He should have felt relief, knowing someone was handling it now. Instead, there was a hollow throb behind his ribs. He kept seeing that face. The quick glance, the cautious step backward, the way the boy had crouched around a styrofoam box like it was something sacred. He couldn't say why he cared. He'd seen hard cases before. He'd written checks for children's hospitals, funded youth mentorship programs. even toured shelters during press events. But that had always been from a distance. This wasn't a press tour. This was something else. He thought about Caleb again, not the troubled version from the end, but the kid from before, the one who used to beat him at card games, the one who'd sneak extra cookies for both of them when their mother wasn't looking, the one who used to say he was going to be a pilot, even though he was scared of heights. Somewhere along the way, Julian had let him slip, focused too much on grades and goals, assuming there'd be time to fix things later. Eli had the same quietness Caleb used to have before the chaos took over, a sort of stillness that made you wonder what was going on behind it, and Julian couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this wasn't coincidence. The name, the look, the timing, none of it made sense, but he'd learned long ago that not everything had to. Some things just showed up, and you figured out why later. Late that night, he got a text from the investigator. Found him. Julian called immediately. Where? Cheap motel in Northside, room 207, registered under a woman named Riley Carr. Looks like the kid's mother. He was seen going in earlier tonight. Julian didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, took the elevator down, and told his driver to wait in the car. The motel was exactly what he expected. A faded sign, 2 flickering hallway lights, and cracked concrete steps leading up to the second floor. He knocked once on the door to room 207 and waited. No answer. He knocked again, firmer. A shadow moved behind the curtain. Then the door opened 3 inches, chain still fastened. A woman's face appeared in the gap. Early 30s, pale, tired. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Who are you? She asked flatly. I met your son a few nights ago, Julian said. Behind Tasso's restaurant. Her face changed instantly. The chain stayed on. If this is about him taking food, I already told him. He didn't steal anything. I just want to talk. She studied him through the gap. You, from some agency? No. Then why are you here? Julian hesitated. Because your son reminded me of someone, and I think he might be family. The door didn't move, but she didn't close it either. He waited. After a long pause, she said, You should go. I just want to help. We don't need your help. Her voice sharpened. He's fine. We're fine. Then the door shut, firm but not slammed. Julian stood there for another minute, then turned and walked back to the car, unsure what he was supposed to do next, but more certain than ever that he wasn't walking away. Tomorrow, he'd find another way in. Julian didn't sleep after leaving the motel. He lay in bed with his eyes open, watching shadows move across the ceiling, replaying the brief exchange over and over. The woman, Riley, had looked at him like he was some kind of threat, like she'd seen his kind before and already decided what he wanted. He could still hear the edge in her voice, not raised but firm, the kind of tone that shut doors before you even had the chance to explain yourself, and maybe she had reason to. But she didn't know who he was or what this was doing to him. The next morning, he cancelled his meetings. He didn't offer a reason. Let the board speculate. Let the stock dip 0.5 point. He didn't care. He sat in his car outside the motel for over an hour, watching the flow of people through the lot. He saw Riley leave dressed in a faded black uniform and cheap sneakers. Hair pulled back, a small plastic container of food in one hand. No car. She walked to the bus stop across the street and climbed aboard without looking back. Julian stayed. At first, he wasn't sure what he was waiting for, only that something told him this wasn't over. He kept the window cracked, letting in stale air, trying to keep himself grounded. There were children playing behind the building, 2 boys with a deflated soccer ball and a girl dragging a laundry bag twice her size. No sign of Eli. He'd begun to think he'd miscalculated when a soft knock landed on the passenger window. Julian looked over. Eli stood outside, his hand still on the glass, wearing the same hoodie but with a newer pair of shoes. Too big for his feet, laced tight. His expression wasn't fearful. Just curious, maybe a little skeptical. Julian unlocked the door. Eli climbed in without asking. "You always park here now?" Julian set his phone on the center console. "Not always." "You waiting for my mom?" "No. You." Eli leaned back into the seat, pulling his knees up. "She gets mad when people bother her, especially men." "I noticed. She thinks you're from CPS or one of those places." "I'm not." Eli didn't respond right away. He picked up Julian's sunglasses from the dash and turned them over in his hands, inspecting them like an artifact. "Why are you being weird?" he finally asked. Julian looked over. "Weird? How?" "You keep showing up. Gave me a coat. Now you're just sitting out here." Julian hesitated. "You reminded me of someone. Someone good or bad? Someone I miss." Eli nodded like he understood. "People say I look like my mom, but I don't think I do." "You don't." Eli shot him a look. "That's supposed to be nice?" Julian smiled a little. "No, just honest." They sat in silence for a while. Julian didn't push him to talk, and Eli didn't seem to feel the need to fill the air. Eventually, Julian reached over and opened the glove box, pulled out a wrapped sandwich. "You eaten yet?" Eli shrugged. "She made eggs, but they weren't good." He took the sandwich anyway, unwrapped it slowly, and took a careful bite. "Want to come with me for a bit?" Julian asked. "Where?" "Someplace warmer." Eli studied him for a few seconds, then nodded. Julian didn't say much during the drive. He wasn't sure how to explain where they were going or why. He just drove with the quiet awareness that none of this was normal, but it also didn't feel wrong. He glanced over once and saw Eli asleep, chin tucked into his shoulder, sandwich half finished in his lap. When they arrived, Julian parked in the underground garage and nudged him gently. Eli woke up groggy, but alert. He followed Julian through the lobby, past marble floors and tall glass walls. The doorman gave them a strange look, but said nothing. Inside the penthouse, Eli wandered like someone stepping into a museum. He didn't touch anything, but looked at everything. "This your place?" he asked. "Yes." "You live alone?" "I do." Eli stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows and stared at the skyline. "Bet the food here doesn't come from the trash." Julian opened the fridge. "You want to find out?" They ended up on the couch eating reheated lasagna and garlic bread. Julian watched him more than he ate. Eli was sharper than most kids his age, asked questions without hesitation, made observations that weren't meant to be clever, but often were. He noticed the little things, like how Julian didn't hang photos on his walls, or how the books in the study didn't look like they'd been read. "You have a kid?" Eli asked at one point. "No." "You ever wanted one?" Julian thought about that. "I didn't think I was the kind of person who should." Eli didn't comment, he just kept eating. They played a few rounds of a chess game Julian hadn't touched in years, and Eli beat him once by accident. The kid didn't gloat, just said, "You made a dumb move," and reset the pieces. Time slipped by too fast. When Eli asked what time it was, Julian checked his watch. Almost 5. Eli jumped up. "She gets off at 6. If she finds out I'm gone, I'll drive you back." They got into the car quietly. The ride back was short and without much talk. When they pulled into the lot, Julian spotted Riley standing outside their door, pacing. She looked like she'd just gotten there, keys still in her hand. Eli jumped out of the car before Julian could stop him. "I'm fine," he called. "I'm right here." Riley turned sharply, her expression shifting from worry to rage. "Where were you?" she demanded. "I was with him." She looked past him and saw Julian stepping out of the car. "You took him?" "He came with me," Julian said, hands up. "He got in the car on his own. I didn't force anything." "You don't know this world," Riley snapped. "You don't get to just pick up a kid because he reminds you of someone." "I wasn't—" "Yes, you were," she cut in. "And I don't care who you are or how much money you have. You don't get to decide what my kid needs." Julian took a step forward. "I just want to help." "Why?" "Because he looks exactly like my dead brother." The words came out sharper than he intended. Eli turned to stare at him. Riley's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Her face drained of colour. She looked at Julian, then at Eli, and something in her went still. She opened the door and gently nudged Eli inside. Then she turned to Julian and shut it without another word. Julian didn't move. The air around him felt suddenly thin. Whatever he'd stepped into, it was deeper than he'd expected, and it wasn't just about resemblance anymore. Julian didn't try knocking again that night. After the door closed, he stood there for a few minutes, unsure what he was waiting for, a second chance to explain maybe, or for Riley to open back up and say something more, but nothing came. The hall stayed quiet except for the low buzz of the parking lot lights. Eventually, he turned and left, the weight of that final exchange settling into his chest. She hadn't denied it. That was what stuck with him most. She hadn't asked what he meant or tried to push back on the word brother. She hadn't said Eli couldn't be connected to Caleb. She'd just looked at Julian, frozen, like she'd known this moment would come and hoped it never would. He gave her space after that. A day passed. Then 2. No more unannounced visits. No more parking outside the motel. He didn't like the idea of waiting, but something told him pressing harder would only make her dig in deeper, so he waited, even if it drove him crazy. On the 3rd day, she called. Her voice was tight and cautious. "Come by, but not during the day, after 8, and don't say anything weird in front of Eli." Julian agreed and showed up 10 minutes early, waiting in his car until the clock hit exactly 8 before he walked up the stairs. The door opened before he could knock. Inside, the room was small, clean, in a rushed kind of way. A stack of folded laundry sat on one bed, and Eli was curled up on the other, headphones on, eyes locked to a tablet screen. Riley nodded toward the bathroom. "Talk in there." It was cramped, with barely enough space for both of them to stand. Julian leaned against the wall, while Riley perched on the closed toilet lid, arms crossed, eyes steady but guarded. "I knew your brother," she said. "Not well. We weren't close, but we were in the same group home when we were kids." Julian kept still. He was quiet, mostly, kept to himself. But not cold. He was nice to me. We'd sneak food out of the cafeteria for the little kids, play cards when the staff weren't looking. I think he felt bad for me. I was a mess back then. He didn't say anything, just waited. One night, it just happened. Nothing serious, not like we were a couple or anything. We barely talked after. I don't think he knew I was pregnant. He left the group home a few months later. I heard he died, but I didn't ask for details. Didn't feel like I had the right to. Julian finally spoke. "Why didn't you ever reach out to anyone?" "I didn't know who to reach out to. Didn't know his last name. Didn't know where he came from. I was 16, scared, and trying to survive. I had Eli alone. Got bounced between shelters and couches. I didn't have time to track down a family that probably didn't even know I existed. Julian ran a hand over his face. So he really is my nephew. Riley didn't answer. She didn't have to. I want to help, he said. I don't want charity. It's not charity. He's family. She stood. That doesn't mean I owe you anything. I'm not saying you do. He deserves better than this. Riley's jaw clenched. You think I don't know that? Julian's tone softened. Then, let me help. She turned to leave the bathroom, but stopped at the door. He's not a project. He's not a broken thing you get to fix to make yourself feel better. I know. You don't, but you're trying. That's something. Over the next few days, they worked out something fragile. Julian wouldn't throw money at her, wouldn't offer apartments or envelopes of cash, but he asked if Eli could spend weekends with him. Take him places, show him things he'd never had a chance to see. Riley resisted at first, but Eli wanted to go, and eventually she agreed. One weekend. Trial run. Julian picked Eli up on Friday afternoon. The kid climbed into the car like he'd done it 100 times, already rattling off questions about what they'd do. Julian didn't have answers. He hadn't planned much. He just wanted to see what Eli liked, what made him light up. They went to a science museum, rode scooters by the river, tried 3 different types of pizza and debated which was best. At night, Eli crashed on the couch in Julian's penthouse, wrapped in a blanket, the television still playing low. Julian stood nearby, watching him sleep longer than he probably should have. It didn't feel like babysitting. It felt like something that had been missing finally found its place. But with each passing day, he questioned whether he was built for this. He'd spent his life in boardrooms and airplanes, not playgrounds and school pickups. He didn't know what to do when Eli scraped his knee, or how to explain decimals for homework, or whether he should allow dessert before dinner just once. He wasn't sure if he was making things better or just more complicated. The next weekend came, and Riley let Eli go without hesitation. By the 3rd, it became routine. She still didn't say much when Julian picked him up, but she didn't shut the door in his face anymore either. One evening, after Julian dropped Eli off and was halfway back to his building, his phone buzzed. It was his CFO. The message was short. We need to talk. Board's concerned. You've been out of step for weeks. Julian pulled over, stared at the message, then closed his eyes. The empire he'd built from scratch was starting to wobble under the weight of something he hadn't planned for. He wasn't surprised. He'd shifted too much, too fast. Stepped back from decisions he would have once micromanaged, missed a quarterly briefing, passed on 3 meetings without explanation. But none of that felt as important as the quiet voice from the back seat, asking if he could come again next weekend. And for the first time in years, Julian wasn't sure what he was supposed to choose. Julian didn't respond to the board right away. He read the message again while parked in a quiet side street and then powered his phone off, something he hadn't done in years unless boarding a plane. The silence that followed felt less like defiance and more like relief. He knew the conversation would come eventually. Numbers slipping, meetings missed, emails unanswered. They tolerated it at first, assuming it was burnout or distraction. But this was different. Julian wasn't drifting. He was choosing. Eli had another weekend coming up. They were walking through an aviation museum when the boy paused beside a World War II exhibit, hands pressed to the glass as he looked at a worn pilot's helmet. Julian stood behind him, watching. Eli didn't say much at first, just stared. Then he turned and asked, "Did you ever want to fly planes?" "No," Julian said. "That was your uncle's dream." Eli looked confused. "Caleb?" "Yeah." "You miss him?" Every day. Eli didn't press. They moved on to the next exhibit. Later, over dinner, he asked, "Why didn't you have kids?" Julian stirred the ice in his water. "I think I was afraid." "Of what?" "Messing it up. Being like I was with my brother. Not seeing what he needed until it was too late." Eli chewed quietly. "You're not messing me up." "Not yet," Julian said. "But I think about it." Eli leaned back. "Well, I think you're doing okay. For someone who's never had to deal with spaghetti sauce on the ceiling." Julian smiled. That had been a disaster. The night before, they'd tried to cook from scratch, and Eli, eager to stir the sauce, had slipped off the stool mid-swing. The ladle flew. So did the sauce. It took Julian an hour to clean, but Eli had laughed so hard he hiccuped for 10 minutes. It was the kind of mess Julian had always avoided, and somehow it made his place feel more lived in. Back at Riley's, things hadn't gotten easier. She was working 2 jobs again, early mornings at a diner, late nights at a warehouse doing inventory. She didn't tell Julian her hours had been cut or that the tips at the diner had dropped. She didn't tell him the motel manager had left another warning note about the overdue rent, or that she was down to 2 outfits suitable for work. She just kept showing up, bruised, quiet, focused. Eli noticed before Julian did. One night, while playing a video game in Julian's apartment, he turned to him out of nowhere and asked, "How much does a motel room cost?" "Depends," Julian said. "Why?" "Because I think my mom's worried." "About what?" "She keeps opening the mail and not saying anything, and she hides the letters now." Julian paused the game. "Has she said anything to you?" Eli shook his head. "She says it's grown-up stuff. But last night she cried in the bathroom. I heard her." Julian didn't say much after that. He took Eli home later than usual and sat outside after dropping him off. Riley didn't come out. The next morning, he called the motel office and paid the balance in full under a shell name. Quiet, no attention, just a transfer, enough to clear the debt and buy a few extra months. He didn't mention it, not right away. 2 days later, she found out. Julian hadn't even gotten through his morning coffee before his doorman buzzed up, saying there was a woman in the lobby insisting she wouldn't leave until she spoke with him. By the time he got downstairs, Riley was already pacing the marble floor, arms tight across her chest, expression hard. "You went behind my back." Julian kept his voice low. "I didn't want you and Eli on the street. I had it under control. You were being evicted. I still had time." Julian gestured toward the hallway. "Let's not do this in front of everyone." She followed him to a quiet corner by the windows, where the city buzzed faintly below. She stood stiff, refusing to sit. "I don't want your money," she said. "I told you that." "I didn't give you money. I paid off something that shouldn't have been your burden to carry alone. You don't get to decide what's my burden. He's my nephew, and he's my son." The silence stretched between them. "You think because you have all this," she said, motioning to the glass and stone around them, "that you can just solve problems by throwing cash at them? That you can patch holes with dollar signs and walk away clean?" Julian didn't flinch. "No, but I can make sure a 7-year-old doesn't have to worry about where he sleeps." She turned away, as if looking at him was the problem. "You're trying to buy him," she said, voice quieter now, but still sharp. "I'm not." "Feels like it." He didn't have an answer. Not one she'd accept. Riley stepped closer, not aggressive, just insistent. "You want to help? Then help me keep my dignity. Let me do things my way. Let me struggle if I have to. I'm not a lost cause." Julian looked at her, really looked. Not just as Eli's mother or the girl from a group home his brother once knew. But as someone who had spent years surviving without any safety net, she wasn't asking for a rescue. She was asking to be respected. "I get it," he said finally. "I do." She nodded once and walked to the elevator. Before the doors closed, she said, "Next time, ask." That evening, Julian sat alone in the penthouse, Eli's game controller still sitting on the couch. He didn't turn the TV on. He didn't check his emails. The tabloid rumour his assistant had warned him about, some headline calling Eli the billionaire's secret child, had started to make rounds online. Photos of them at the museum, walking through the park. Speculation. Noise. He didn't care. But he also knew things couldn't stay like this. Not with Riley barely staying afloat. Not with Eli bouncing between two completely different worlds. Something had to give. He just didn't know what yet. The week after Riley confronted Julian in his lobby, things between them cooled into a fragile, distant truce. Julian stayed away unless it was to pick up or drop off Eli. Riley kept her conversations clipped and impersonal. The weekend visits continued, but the air had changed. Julian started wondering if Eli noticed. He hadn't said much. He still arrived with his usual energy, still asked his long-winded questions, and made Julian laugh in ways he didn't expect. But there was a shift. Less joy, more watching. The boy had started clocking every silence between them, every look that lasted too long. Then the story hit a second wave. One of the bigger media outlets picked it up, a blurred photo of Julian and Eli leaving a tech exhibit, the headline bold enough to spark debate, "Is this the billionaire's hidden heir?" Julian's assistant sent him a flood of emails from the comms team, all asking if they should issue a denial or ride it out. He said nothing. He knew who started it. Didn't matter anymore. It was out there. And it didn't stop with speculation. 3 days later, a woman showed up at Riley's motel door with a clipboard and a badge. A caseworker. Someone from Child Services. Riley didn't answer at first, but the woman returned the next morning, and again that evening. On the third visit, she caught Riley heading to work. Eli was already at school. The questions were polite at first. Routine. But Riley recognized the pattern. She'd lived through it before. Too many case numbers, too many routine visits that ended with a child in a stranger's car and a mother screaming down the sidewalk. It didn't matter that she had no charges, no record, no actual reason to be flagged. All it took was the image. A boy in a cheap motel. A mother who worked 16 hours a day. A billionaire who looked like a better option on paper. When Julian heard what happened, it wasn't from Riley. It was from his lawyer. "She's under review," the lawyer said. "It's minor now, but the fact that the state is sniffing around means we need to be proactive." Julian sat at his desk. The skyline stretched out behind him. Papers untouched in front of him. Proactive how? You have standing. You're a blood relative. If it escalates, you can petition for partial custody. Joint legal, at the very least. You'd have more control, and it protects Eli from being placed elsewhere. Julian didn't answer. "You'd need to make a formal filing," the lawyer added. "But with the right narrative, you'd win." Julian knew the numbers. He'd read enough depositions and court documents to understand how these things played out. But he also knew Riley. She wouldn't see it as protection. She'd see it as betrayal. He waited 2 days before saying anything. Riley answered on the third call. Her voice was flat. "They already talked to me twice," she said. "You don't have to call and act surprised. I didn't send them. I know that. But they wouldn't be here if your life didn't leak into mine. I didn't ask for the attention. But you didn't stop it either." There was a pause. Julian looked down at the paperwork on his desk, the draft petition sitting beneath a manila folder. his name already typed across the top. "I was told I should file for joint custody," he said. The silence on the other end was immediate and sharp. "You were told," Riley said. "By who? Your legal team? Your PR advisor? Was it during lunch, between a tasting menu and a quarterly report? They said it was the only way to make sure Eli doesn't end up in the system. So your solution is to rip him away from me?" Her voice didn't rise, but something broke through it, like she was struggling not to yell. "After everything I've done, everything I've held together, you want to fix it by putting your name on a piece of paper like that? Changes who raised him?" "I didn't file," Julian said quickly. "But you thought about it." She hung up. The next week, Julian didn't see Eli. No visits, no texts, no returned calls. The motel phone rang unanswered. He tried stopping by once, but no one opened the door. A few days later, he got a call from Eli's school. The principal said Eli had missed the last 2 days, and when they called Riley, there was no answer. Julian drove over, heart pounding, trying not to imagine worst-case scenarios. But when he got there, the motel manager said they'd checked out. Gone. Julian drove around the neighborhood for hours, checked every park, every fast food place Eli liked. Nothing. That night, he barely slept. The next morning, he called in a favor and had someone comb through transit cameras. It didn't help. The next night, just after 10, Julian's phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. It was a clerk at Tasso's, the same restaurant from the alley. She said there was a kid behind the dumpsters, curled up on a piece of cardboard, shivering, said he'd asked for Julian. Julian got there in 12 minutes. Eli was tucked into himself behind the same bin, wearing the hoodie Julian had bought him months ago. His face was flushed, his lips cracked. When Julian crouched beside him, Eli didn't speak. He just leaned into him without a word. Julian wrapped his coat around him and called Riley. She picked up on the second ring, voice low, frantic. "I'm on my way," she said. "Is he okay?" Shaken, cold, but alive. When she arrived, she didn't rush. She walked up slowly, eyes locked on her son. Julian stepped back and let her drop to her knees beside him. Eli pressed into her arms, and she held him tight, rocking slightly. For a moment, it was just them. Julian waited until she looked up. She didn't glare, didn't accuse, just tired, her voice worn to the edge. "I didn't know where else to go." Julian nodded. Neither did he. They sat there in the alley for a long time, 3 of them in silence. No boardrooms, no lawyers, no forms to sign, just concrete underfoot, and a kid between them who didn't want to choose sides anymore. Eli spoke quietly, voice scratchy from the cold. "I don't want you two to fight anymore," he said. "Can't we just be a family?" Neither of them answered right away. They didn't have a plan, but in that quiet moment, both knew something had to change. The old way wasn't working anymore. The ride back from the alley was quiet. Eli fell asleep halfway through, curled against Riley's side in the back seat. Julian drove slowly, glancing at them now and then in the mirror, not sure if he felt comforted or ashamed. They hadn't spoken much after Eli's question. There hadn't been anything to say. He'd looked at Riley, and she'd looked back, and something passed between them that wasn't anger or blame, for once. Just a kind of shared weariness. A mutual realization that whatever they were doing, it couldn't go on this way. At the motel, Riley didn't ask Julian to come inside, but she didn't stop him either. He helped carry Eli in, laid him down gently, and stepped back while Riley covered him with a worn quilt. The room looked emptier than usual. A duffel bag in the corner, the shelves cleared. She was packing to leave. Julian leaned against the wall and watched her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, with the same care she folded his clothes. The silence stretched. Finally, she turned. "You don't have to fix everything," she said. "I know you're trying, but I'm not asking you to carry all of this." Julian nodded. "I know. I'm not trying to take him from you." Riley didn't respond right away. She walked to the small kitchenette, filled a glass of water, and sipped it slowly, like she was stalling. When she finally met his eyes, her expression was softer than it had been in weeks. "I don't want to fight you either," she said. "But I don't know how to do this with someone else in the picture. I've only ever done it alone." Julian took a breath and stepped closer, lowering his voice so Eli wouldn't stir. "Then let's try something different. Not custody, not courts, just partnership. We do this together. You and me. Equal say, equal time. I don't make decisions without you, and you don't have to carry the weight alone anymore." She stared at him, searching for the catch. "No lawyers?" she asked. "No lawyers. No contracts? Just trust." Riley let out a short, dry laugh. "Trust doesn't come easy for me." "I figured," Julian said, "but I'm still asking for it." She didn't answer. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Eli. He was sound asleep, his face peaceful for the first time in days. Julian followed her gaze and sat in the chair across from her. "What would it even look like?" she asked. "This partnership?" Julian thought for a moment. "I've been working on something. There's a house in Brookvale, historic but not flashy. Big yard, quiet street. I bought it years ago to renovate, but never had a reason to finish it. I could turn it into something for all of us. 2 full bedrooms, space for Eli, 1 for you, an actual home." Riley gave him a wary look. "And where do you live?" "Same place," he said. "But I'd come by. You'd bring Eli to my place sometimes. We'd eat together, figure out homework, pick him up from school if one of us gets stuck. Nothing formal, just a rhythm. You want joint parenting without joint living? For now, 1 step at a time." She folded her arms, still uncertain. "And what do you get out of this?" "I get to know my nephew. I get to be part of something I didn't even realize I was missing." She stared at the floor for a long time, then said quietly, "Eli would love that house." Julian smiled. "Then let's start there." Over the next month, the plan slowly took shape. Julian brought in his design team and gave them a simple direction: comfort, not luxury. He wanted wood floors, deep couches, a kitchen that could handle burnt pancakes and spilled juice. Riley helped pick colours. Eli chose the dinosaur wallpaper for his room and insisted on a reading tent in the corner. Julian didn't argue. He even built the thing himself one Sunday, using a flashlight and instructions that made no sense. It collapsed twice before Eli declared it perfect anyway. They fell into a rhythm neither had expected. Weekdays were still split, but weekends blurred. Julian would show up on a Saturday morning and find Riley already cooking. Eli would drag them both into the living room to play board games or insist on movie nights where they never made it to the end without someone falling asleep. The tension between Riley and Julian didn't disappear completely, but it changed. Arguments became shorter. Apologies came faster. She stopped flinching when he offered to help with groceries. He stopped questioning her instincts about Eli. There were still rough days. Riley had a hard time stepping back when Julian offered help, and Julian sometimes forgot to ask before making small decisions, but they corrected each other without resentment. Eli, for his part, seemed lighter. He stopped asking whose house he was going to. He just started calling it home. One night, after Eli had fallen asleep on the couch mid-movie, Riley and Julian ended up on the porch, mugs in hand, watching the wind stir the trees. They didn't talk much, just sat in the quiet. Julian set his mug down on the railing and looked over at her. "I used to think finding Eli was some strange accident," he said. "Some weird twist that pulled me into something I wasn't ready for. And now, I think I was meant to find him. But now, I think I was meant to find you, too." Riley looked at him. No sarcasm, no smirk, just stillness. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either. The house settled into its own rhythm as the seasons changed. By late spring, the air was warmer, the windows were open more often, and laughter drifted through the hallways in place of silence. Eli's room had become his universe. Dinosaur wallpaper on one wall, shelves lined with paperbacks, a soccer ball always half deflated in the corner. His reading tent stayed up even after the ceiling fan blew it over 3 times. Julian tried to fix it once, but only made it worse, so Riley reassembled it, shaking her head the whole time, but smiling while she did it. They weren't married. They hadn't even called what they had a relationship, at least not out loud. But they moved around each other like people who were no longer circling. Julian still lived in his penthouse during the week, but he came by often, sometimes to drop off a new book for Eli, sometimes just to have dinner. It wasn't formal, no schedule, no strict agreement, just life unfolding one shared moment at a time. Eli was thriving. He had started at a new school a few weeks after the move, and despite the nerves on his first day, he adjusted quickly. Julian had walked him to class that morning, dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt like any other dad. He waited outside with Riley, watching through the window as Eli found his seat. Later that week, Eli brought home a flyer for a student business fair and asked Julian to help him come up with an idea. Julian didn't just help, he sat down with a whiteboard and taught him how to build a simple pitch. By the end of the month, Eli had turned his idea for recycled cardboard sculptures into a weekend project and sold 2 of them for $5 each. Julian matched the sales and taught him what reinvestment meant. They started calling it their company, even though the living room was the only office they needed. Riley had changed too, not in personality, but in presence. She held herself differently now. Stronger, not so much hardened by the years, but steadied. Julian had quietly put money into a trust and used it to help her start her own cleaning business. Not a chain, not a franchise, just her. 3 clients to start, then 5. Eventually, she hired one woman from her old job at the diner, and then another. Julian never took credit. He never mentioned the money again. Riley never asked for more. She grew it on her own terms, the way she wanted, and that mattered more than anything. There were still hard days. Eli caught the flu once, and Riley stayed up through the night, while Julian went on a pharmacy run in the middle of a thunderstorm. The dishwasher broke, and no one knew how to fix it, so Julian tried and ended up flooding the kitchen. Riley laughed so hard, she cried. He offered to buy a new one the next day, and she let him. Sundays became a ritual. Pancakes. Not always successful, but always served with syrup, and Eli's attempt to flip at least one by himself. They'd go to the park after breakfast, sometimes just the 3 of them, sometimes with friends Julian had invited over. A quiet blend of 2 different lives, slowly becoming one. One afternoon in early summer, Julian took Eli to the cemetery. It wasn't something he had planned for weeks. He just woke up, made coffee, and realized the time had come. Riley didn't ask questions when he told her. She just helped Eli put on his good shoes. The drive was long and quiet. Eli asked once where they were going, and Julian told him to meet someone. When they arrived, Julian parked under the shade of an old oak and led Eli across the lawn to a small, unadorned headstone. It read, Caleb Roth, 1980, 7, 2003. Always searching, forever missed. Eli stood beside him, quiet, reading the stone. That was your brother? He asked. Julian nodded. Yeah, he would have been your uncle. He died young. He did? Eli didn't say much after that. He knelt down and placed the little paper crane he'd made in the car on the edge of the grave. Julian hadn't known he'd brought anything. They stood there for a while, not speaking, until a breeze picked up and scattered leaves over the nearby grass. Later that night, Julian sat through the company's annual gala, a formal event with polished speeches and well-dressed executives. He'd always hated the part where he had to take the stage and say something about vision or growth or legacy. This year, when the microphone was handed to him, he set his notes aside. I used to think success was measured by what you could control, he said. What you could buy, fix, or rebuild. But the last year taught me something else. Sometimes the things that save you are the ones you didn't plan for. He paused, letting the room quiet. This year, I want to thank two people. One small and hungry, who reminded me what courage looks like, and one fierce and brave, who reminded me what trust feels like. There were murmurs of confusion, polite applause. No one in that room knew exactly who he meant. Julian didn't explain. Back at the house, the party leftovers were packed into boxes. Riley had sent Julian home with cake, despite his protests that he'd already eaten too much. He left it on the kitchen counter while he changed out of his tux. Eli had stayed up late watching a cartoon marathon, but eventually conked out under a blanket on the couch. Just before bed, Julian passed through the kitchen and saw the cake box slightly open, a paper napkin beside it. He peeked inside. One slice was missing. Outside, the porch light glowed faintly. He stepped out and spotted Eli at the edge of the yard, kneeling beside the fence. There was another kid there, a boy in torn jeans and a faded t-shirt, standing alone on the sidewalk. Julian walked quietly toward them. Please don't call the police, the boy said, barely above a whisper. I was just hungry. Eli held out the napkin, with the slice of cake folded neatly inside. It's okay, he said. I know someone who can help. Julian stood back and watched the boy take the cake, nod once, and disappear down the sidewalk. Eli stayed where he was, looking out into the street for a long time, before finally turning and heading back toward the house. Julian met him halfway. Couldn't sleep? He asked. Not really. You did good. Eli shrugged. I remembered how it felt. They walked inside together, no words left to say. The door closed behind them, and the house, once cold and quiet, settled again into something that felt like peace. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video. It helps the channel more than you know. Want more heartfelt stories like this? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let me know how this one made you feel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.